Hello and welcome back to the third and final video in this series called Slavery in the British Colonies. This portion of the video is going to focus specifically on the resistance and institutionalization of the system of slavery. So there's two main learning objectives from your APUSH curriculum: explain the causes and effects of slavery in the various British colonial regions, and explain how enslaved people responded to slavery. So you can take a look at the key concepts more closely, but some of the main ideas is that a system of chattel slavery becomes the dominant labor system, and there were specific laws which enforced this system in the colonies. And additionally, Africans developed both covert and overt means to resist. So we'll go into examples of both of those. So to start, here's your outline. We're going to first address some early laws and practices, the resistance efforts, the institutionalization, and a brief note about the social structures. So before we begin, I want to start by discussing some notes about the use of dehumanizing language from history. So specifically when looking at primary sources from this time period, you're going to find the use of the N-word and forms of the N-word. And it's important to note that these words have different meanings for different groups of people and that they've been used throughout history for various reasons. But today, the term Negro is outdated and inappropriate, but until more recently, it was the acceptable term for referring to African Americans. So that's something to note when you're looking at some primary sources, which you will see in this slideshow. So early practices. Although the first Africans arrived to the British colonies in 1619, there won't be an official law until 1641. So up until then, there were common practices, but not necessarily any laws. And even up until more the 1660s, 1670s, we're not going to see strict laws governing the institution of slavery. So a couple of the main things that you're going to see repeated throughout the slideshow is that enslaved persons will inherit their status from their mother. So if their mother was enslaved or Black, then the child would have that same status. And in the less likely scenario of a white woman being the mother, then the child would be mixed race, which is the same in the other scenario as well. However, with the white mother and they inherit that status, they're going to be more marginalized because they won't be enslaved. But they will demonstrate that a sexual liaison happened between a white woman and a Black man, and that was considered illegal and punishable by a crime. So here's an example. In Virginia in 1630, a white man was ordered to be soundly whipped for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and the shame of Christianity by defiling his body and lying with a Negro. And so this is really the first example of a penalty of it being considered a crime for interracial relationships. So there was a lack of systematic legal codes before 1670, and so there was quite a variety. There was a range of the way that enslaved persons would have been treated. So for some places, in some instances, Africans would have been treated like indentured servants and freed after a few years. In many places, Sundays were considered a day that Africans could labor for themselves, which meant that they could acquire property and manage that property, and then sometimes sell it and use those earnings to purchase their freedom. For Black freedmen and women, they had the right to move freely, to baptize their children. You can read the other examples. But before 1670, with the lack of those legal codes, there was more autonomy and agency available. It's not to say that it was allowed for all people everywhere, but it was just more vague, which allowed for certain people to have different experiences than what we see after 1670 when there are those legal codes in place. So some examples of some of the early laws are what you can see here in the blue boxes. In 1641, we see the first recognition of lawful captives. In 1661, we see that the status is passed through the mother. In 1664, baptism would not affect the status. And the reason why these laws start to become more prevalent as we move closer to the 1670s is that the number of enslaved persons in the colonies begins to grow significantly around that same time. It is also important to note, as this was stated in an earlier video, is that every single colony had enslaved persons, and every single one passed laws that discriminated against African Americans. So here's an example of an act, a very famous act from 1705 in Virginia that created a system of slave codes for Virginia. So the first example, the bullet point there, is describing that interracial marriage is illegal. The second bullet point there is describing how a owner of enslaved persons has the ability to punish their enslaved people, and if they kill those people in those punishments, there is no crime for that. And then the third point there is that slaves were not allowed to have weapons and were not allowed to move freely, had to have a pass. And so those are just three examples of slave codes from that act. There are more. Ibram Kendi, in his book Stamped from the Beginning, which is an excellent read if you have time, describes the impact of these slave codes from Virginia. So I'll read his excerpt here. Meanwhile, the enslaved population continued to rise noticeably, which led to fear of revolts, and then in 1705, new racist codes to prevent revolts and secure human property up and down the Atlantic coast. Massachusetts authorities forbade interracial relationships, began taxing import of captives, and raided Indians and Negroes with horses and hogs during a revision of the tax code. Virginia lawmakers made slave patrols compulsory for non-slaveholding whites. These groups of white citizens were charged with policing slaves, enforcing discipline, and guarding routes of escape. The Virginia legislature also denied blacks the ability to hold office. To seal the unity and racial loyalty, Virginia's white lawmakers seized and sold all property owned by any slave, and the profit thereof applied to the use of the poor and of the said parish. This story would be told many times in American history. Black property legally or illegally seized, the resulting Black destitution blamed on Black inferiority, the past discrimination ignored when the blame was assigned. Virginia's 1705 code mandated that planters provide freed white servants with 50 acres of land. The resulting white prosperity was then attributed to white superiority. So this passage is just expressing some of those changes that began to happen as the number of enslaved persons increased and the system of slavery became more institutionalized as a result. So what we see happening is two types of resistance: overt, obvious resistance, and covert or undercover resistance. It's important to note that these resistance efforts began immediately. So on the Middle Passage, as enslaved persons were taken from Africa and brought to the Americas, there were significant efforts to obtain freedom, reclaim their humanity on these ships, and often women played an important role. Women were on ships were often not chained in the same way that the men were, which allowed for the crew to have easier access to them to engage in brutal rapes and treatment. But because women were often less chained to a specific area, they often were able to play a really important role in gaining access to weapons or unchaining men to be a part of those resistance efforts. But in the colonies, on land, in newspapers in the colonial era, there was approximately 50 suspected or actual slave revolts that were reported. And in each of these reports, they were cast as violent criminals, as opposed to people reacting to brutality or attempting to access their freedom. So even the way that they were framed in these newspapers demonstrates the view that white Europeans had on their ability to act as human beings. And it really created a difficulty for enslaved persons. If they did not resist, then they showed that that was the correct place for them as a slave to another person. If they non-violently resisted, then they were brutalized. If they killed for their freedom, then they perpetuated stereotypes that they were barbaric murderers who deserved to be enslaved. So one specific rebellion that you should be aware of is called the Stono Rebellion. So it's important to remember that during this time, the Spanish still controlled Florida, and that border was often contested. And in the late 1600s, the Spanish offered freedom to any runaway enslaved persons. And so that increased the number of enslaved persons that were running away and attempting to enter Florida and become part of the Spanish Empire. So the Stono Rebellion becomes the largest uprising by enslaved persons before the American Revolution and happens in 1739 in South Carolina. Approximately 60 enslaved persons, led by Cato, began traveling through South Carolina, attempting to get to Florida, headed to Spanish Florida, where they would achieve freedom. And as they went, they burned buildings, they killed whites indiscriminately. And terrified slave owners ended up calling for the militia. When the militia met the enslaved persons, then there was a battle, and many of them were killed or captured. But a few did actually make it to freedom, and they joined other free blacks living in Florida. So what's the significance here? The significance is that widespread fear over slave revolts begins to enter the minds of many whites, especially in the southern colonies, where the enslaved population began to outnumber the whites. And so severe new restrictions were placed upon free and enslaved blacks. So here's a quote by the Virginia governor in 1723. Only by fixing a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes, by excluding them from the great privilege of being a freedman, could they be taught that a distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of Englishmen, with whom they were never to be accounted equal. So beginning in the 1700s, we start seeing more and more language describing the racial differences, and that whites and blacks were different and did not have the same rights. So there were other types of resistance as well, covert resistance, and often these would still result in punishments, but they were efforts to reclaim humanity, to demonstrate agency, to frustrate the slave owners in order to take back aspects of who they were and know that they were not completely subdued by the system. So the institutionalization of slavery as a result of the increased number creates a system that becomes known as chattel slavery. So this is the legal definition that was applied to Africans in the British colonies, which basically states that the enslaver has absolute control and ownership, and the enslaved persons and their children were property. Chattel is akin to cattle, and so both words come from a similar place. So it's really making African slaves synonymous with how plantation owners would be required to treat animals that they owned. A Virginian describes at this time that these two words, Negro and slave, have by custom grown homogenous and convertible. So now in the 1700s, we see that these two words are basically synonymous. As far as social structures go, the Africans that came to the New World, although significantly diverse, coming from various groups in Africa, when considered just from that continent, become the largest single group of non-English immigrants. By 1775, which is a little out of period too, they account for 20% of the colonial population, and 90% of them were living in the southern colonies. There obviously was widespread resentment of their status. As the numbers increased, they were able to sustain their culture more significantly. But at the same time, those cultural practices became more alarming to whites, and thus more restrictions were placed on them. For example, not allowing for Sundays to be a day where Africans could work for themselves anymore. So there is some information continuing our ideas of the causes and effects of slavery, and also an understanding of how enslaved people responded to slavery. So I hope that this was helpful for you for understanding this concept. If so, please like and subscribe.